We're all good, Jack?
We're all good. Take it away.
Awesome. Well, welcome back. Sorry our rate of spread on that cute little graphic was a little off, but it is 20 and we're going to get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Clark McCreedy, who is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service contaminant specialist and wildlife biologist out of the East Lansing, Michigan Ecological Services Field Office. And today he is going to be sharing with us about building and sustaining situational awareness. I would remind everyone that you certainly can submit questions via the chat box. I will be monitoring those and will supply them at the end of Clark's presentation, ask him those questions. And yeah, so with that, take it away, Clark.
All right, thanks, Andy. And unfortunately, I can't see the chat, but that's neither here nor there. We'll make it work. So,
well, and Clark, I will just remind you that that is my job, and okay, you don't have to worry about it. So I got it.
All right, thanks, Andy. So, disclaimer right off the bat. In terms of what I will be speaking about today, I'm not an expert. I'm a student and maybe even a novice. And what I'm going to talk about may be a little bit unconventional for some of you. It certainly was for me, but I'm convinced of the value. So I'll have two requests for you today. One early in this presentation, and that will be to enter some very brief information in the chat. And then if we have time, I'll ask you to do that again as we wrap things up. So to begin with, you shouldn't be a stranger to the term situational awareness, or you wouldn't be attending a conference with a title like Burning Issues. So the truth of the matter is, I doubt you can read any wildland fire accident report or facilitated learning analysis or lessons learned report that doesn't make some mention of the idea of situational awareness or the need to improve situational awareness. So it's a topic that we are all likely, hopefully, familiar with. So the why of situational awareness should be fairly self-evident. It's a topic that has real, genuine, and occasionally severe consequences. And we'll touch a bit more on that when we talk a bit about the history of situational awareness. So, similarly, I think we all have a pretty good idea of what we are talking about when we use the term situational awareness. Nonetheless, I want to start with a definition, and I'm hoping we end this discussion today by landing again on this definition. To do that, I want us to spend some time talking about the how of situational awareness. So that's where we're starting, and that's where we're going. To start then, something about the history of situational awareness. Whoops, we got to get this to work. All right, there we go. So I'm hoping, Andy, we've landed on that second slide. So okay, perfect. Our appreciation for the concept of situational awareness is really due to the foundational work of Dr. Micah Ensley. So something about Dr. Ensley, the short list. Master's degree from Purdue University, hence the Purdue hat today, a doctoral degree from the University of Southern California. But one of the most notable aspects of her career was that she was the former chief scientist for the U.S. Air Force. And so you can easily imagine, I think, what her interest in situational awareness was, that being to enhance the dynamic decision-making of fighter jet pilots traveling at about 1,800 miles an hour with a couple hundred gallons of fuels and armaments strapped to their seats. So Dr. Ensley has in fact published over 200 refereed articles on situational awareness. And it doesn't matter whether we're looking at situational awareness in law enforcement, military, medicine, or fire, any of those discussions generally refer to the foundational work done by Micah Ensley. So she's a good place to start, and this is how she defines situational awareness. Said another way, though, in any after action review that we might conduct, you or I might more directly define the term by saying knowing what's going on so you can figure out what to do. But think for a minute about how we generally treat the topic of situational awareness. Think about your annual fire refresher, for example. What do we typically do? And I'd like to suggest we have collectively developed, or most frequently, developed that bullet list of characteristics of the fire environment with the thought that as we collectively acknowledge and discuss those characteristics, the hope and intent is that we'll internalize some of that. And that has real value because it draws upon the body of our collective experience. So, in fact, what I would like to do for just a minute is to go through what should be a familiar exercise. If we were able to be in the same room together, as opposed to the same chat room, I'd like to think we're going to have a fairly rigorous conversation as we develop that bullet list of characteristics. So I want this slide to kick it off. This is a type 2 crew out west somewhere. And I like this slide because it reveals a prominent characteristics of the fire environment that we frequently encounter. So I'm going to take 15 seconds off. I'm going to get a drink of water, hopefully recover my Zoom composure while you fill in the chat box with that bullet list of characteristics of the fire environment. So we'll see how this works. Have at it. 3, 2, 1, engage. So in no particular order, this is what I could fit on a slide comfortably. So varied experience levels, and that was that previous slide. If you looked closely, there are 2 or 3 individuals with brand spanking new yellows. Flashy fuels, difficult terrain, heavy equipment, media, public attention, adjacent residential areas, transitions between environments. And I was thinking about this, thinking about how we use marsh masters in the Midwest. Infrastructure, pipelines, power lines, aircraft, heat, humidity, hazard trees, fencing, refuse, illegal activity, wildlife, poisonous plants, smoke and more smoke, and now global pandemics. So Andy from the chat, anything else? You may be on mute.
I think you about covered it.
Okay, good. All right. I think it's entirely fair to say that this is typically how we often approach situational awareness, by characterizing our external environment with the intent of building familiarity with the hazards associated with the wildland fire environment. So where else are we most likely to encounter mention, discussion, or evaluation of situational awareness? To some extent, we most often think of situational awareness post hoc, that is, after the fact, in formal evaluations of the degree to which we have or have not effectively exercised situational awareness. And I completely agree with the emphasis on situational awareness that you'll find in these evaluations of our actions as wildland fire managers. They are the record of our collective experience. And experience is an obvious correlate of our capacity to achieve good situational awareness, which is to say that we all ought to be students of these lessons learned. But what I hope to achieve today is to give you an entirely different perspective from which to think about situational awareness, because I believe it has the genuine potential to build and sustain your practice of situational awareness. So to start, I want to revisit Dr. Ensley. Before that, just sort of a quick recap. So first off, situational awareness is grounded in the science of decision-making in high-risk environments. And our consideration or training for situational awareness is frequently associated with characterization of the fire environment, and most often is treated in post hoc or after the fact analyses that are really the collection of our collective experience, and that deserves our attention. That said, I think there's more that we can bring to this topic of situational awareness. So to make an effort in that direction, we're going to revisit Dr. Ensley. So as we look again at this definition, I want you to more deliberately think about how situational awareness actually occurs. Dr. Ensley describes situational awareness as being composed of three fundamental characteristics. So perception of my environment, comprehension of what that means, and projection of the near-term outcomes. So for those of us in the federal government enamored with the use of acronyms, that would be PCP, perception, comprehension, projection. And to demonstrate these characteristics, Dr. Ensley got out her Sharpie pen and drew a picture. In fact, if you go to the Google and search for situational awareness diagram, you're going to get a couple hundred different variation of Dr. Ensley's 1988 diagram. So how does the mechanics of situational awareness actually work? Or where does this process really take place? The environment in which situational awareness actually occurs is somewhere here above your shoulders, which is to say, situational awareness is fundamentally a function of your own internal environment. So, quick example of the Ensley model. Excuse me. So let's say I'm lighting a prescribed fire on the Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. And I actually may feel or perceive the wind against my face. I may comprehend then that the wind is changing and picking up speed. I project then that my fire behavior or rates of spread may quickly change. So does this make sense? If it does, you're not alone. So let's take a look at the expanded version of Dr. Ensley's model. And this is what it really looks like, because it incorporates the idea of working memory. And I suggest that you think of working memory as the available bandwidth of your mind's own internet. Bandwidth being a concept that we're all coming to appreciate in the age of COVID and the virtual conference. So said another way, working memory might be thought of as the available bandwidth of your capacity to achieve situational awareness. And the important question is, well, does this matter? Well, it's been said that at any given moment, that humans exercise at most 10% of their brain's capacity. And if anyone can identify where that figure comes from in the archives of recent popular culture, type it into the chat. The truth of the matter is that we in fact use 100% of our brain's capacity. Think about this from a biological or evolutionary perspective. If your an organism that spends its days trying to avoid becoming someone else's dinner, your brain is functioning at hyperspeed to evaluate every possible fragment of information about your environment. The brain is primed for decision-making at hyperspeed. And it's primed to make the decision as to whether to take flight or to stand and fight. So it wants to gather as much information as humanly possible, as rapidly as possible. And that is precisely why there is this physiological necessity for this thing called sleep. Our brains need a rest. Moreover, the brain's capacity, the capacity of your working memory is finite. It is limited. You can, and we often do, try to stuff more into the brain than can possibly fit in the folds of our gray matter. And in doing so, the research demonstrates rather conclusively that we do, in fact, reduce the size of that decision space in our working memory. And this is a fact. The reality, though, is far more complex. Even when occupied with an immediate task, for example, like listening to a talk during a virtual conference, our minds tend to wander. So much so that approximately 47%, 50% of our waking moments are spent somewhere else other than the task at hand. These numbers come from a well-known study out of Harvard. So if we're spending 50% of our waking moments mind wandering, what does that mean for situational awareness? So I shared this quote that you're seeing with a colleague of mine in the office, Mandy Annis, and she made the comment that most car accidents occur within relatively close proximity to a person's home. Well, I was curious, and the Google was just a couple of keystrokes away, so I had to ask. And in fact, it's absolutely true. So, is being in proximity to your home inherently physically more dangerous? Are the roads worse? Are the curves sharper? I really sort of doubt it. I think something else is going on. So let me ask, how many of you have driven by an exit while being entirely somewhere else in thought? Or if you got to your destination, perhaps you could remember very little of the drive that got you there. So before COVID, if you left your home in the morning, did you indulge in planning your day as you drove? Were you walking through the conversations or the meetings that you were already anticipating? And on the way home, as you turned off the main road, were you already fixing dinner, though the kitchen was miles away? When we do this, and we all have done it, what happens here to the bandwidth of your decision space, the space in your working memory? What happens to your ability to make a dynamic decision, a critical decision in a high-risk environment while strapped to 30 gallons of fuel traveling at 60 to 80 miles per hour? So I think what is happening is this: the available capacity of your working memory is diminished, and your ability to perceive, comprehend, and to project outcomes is compromised. You are asking yourself to make dynamic decisions in a high-risk environment using faculties that have been shortchanged. The fact of the matter is that wandering away mentally, particularly while you're driving, may have some consequences. The risks may be genuinely small, but the consequences might be all too real. Here is a not so fun fact. Driving while impaired results in more deaths, but driving while distracted results in more injuries, some 400,000 per year in the United States. But in a way, this makes absolute perfect sense. If you're driving impaired, what is the bandwidth of your decision space, your working memory? It may be effectively zeroed out. So, what is the number one cause of distracted driving? And spoiler alert, it's not cell phone use. It is, excuse me, it is actually mind wandering, the loss of attention to the task at hand. And while I'm casting a light on distraction, think about other factors. And we mentioned some of those in that earlier conversation we had. Think about other factors and how they might affect our attention. How about stress at work, conflict, fatigue, grief, or the very real prospect of illness in the time of COVID? Moreover, it's probably more accurate to think of the sum or cumulative effect of these factors that may capture our attention and diminish our working memory. Dr. Amishi Jha says it this way, much more concisely than I did. Where the attention goes, the brain follows. In other words, the brain is an entirely willing participant in the effort to distract your attention. So Dr. Jha uses this consideration of our tendency to mentally wander away to introduce the concept of present moment awareness. And she defines it this way. Present moment awareness refers to a state of sustained attention to and awareness of the present moment. And this is where we're going, enhancing present moment awareness to build and sustain situational awareness. So, to recap again, situational awareness is inherently a mental process involving perception, comprehension, and projection. Secondly, the mind is not just prone to wander, it is probably hardwired to wander, so much so that distraction is a given. Lastly, this may and does, I believe, affect your capacity to achieve situational awareness. The fact of the matter is, it probably matters. So, I have to somewhat apologize. I have thoroughly bombarded you with background, but it builds the foundation for what follows. So, thank you for hanging in there. So, at this point, we're going to shift gears a bit. So, let me ask you a specific fire-related question. Do we accept the idea that wildland firefighters, fire managers, ought to maintain some baseline level of physical fitness? And do we accept the fact that this requires regular, disciplined, focused effort? So this is something of a no-brainer. And I'll use that to ask this next question. What if we regarded the brain like we do a muscle that could be trained? Could we improve attention or focus and thereby enhance our situational awareness? Well, long story short, there are a host of neuroscientists, psychologists, physicians, among others, that have demonstrated rather decisively that yes, in fact, we can train the brain. And in particular, we can train the brain to focus more closely on the present moment, as opposed to wandering away to the future or returning somewhere to the past. And the key to that effort is recognizing the relative value of distraction versus the value of awareness or attention. We can, in fact, cultivate present moment awareness through disciplined, regular practice. And the key to this is actually rewarding yourself for the practice. And I call this the jelly donut exercise for the brain. So in terms of rewarding the brain, for example, if I'm walking away from a conversation where I have deliberately, intentionally made the effort to listen actively, to not talk over the top of my colleagues, not being distracted by what I need to do next, then giving myself or yourself a mental pat on the back, a mental cup of coffee or a real one, or maybe a calorie-free mental jelly donut helps, excuse me, helps the brain to recognize the behavior. In this case, attention and focus that we hope to make habitual. So acknowledging, if only to myself, that I have done the right thing in the given moment is the reinforcement that the brain is looking for. This is not effortless, but it has real value. And what this does is reinforce the brain's interpretation of appropriate behaviors. And believe it or not, we can actually build new neural circuitry that reinforces the behavior, in this case, the focus of our attention. The cultivation of present moment awareness or focus is really an exercise with the same sort of intent with which you approach physical exercise. The intent here, though, is to strengthen the focus and resolve of the brain, to build, in fact, the muscle memory of the brain. In terms of value, excuse me again, I don't want you to take my word for it. So I have attached to this presentation a list of references with hyperlinks, and maybe Andy's throwing some of those in the chat now. And those will direct you to a few foundational videos, books, and publications. And if we have time, I will walk you through some of those. The cultivation of present moment awareness has been termed the practice of mindfulness. And within the mindfulness community of practice, there are really two areas of emphasis, formal and informal. Within the community that emphasizes formal training to cultivate mindfulness, there are well over 250 teaching hospitals and medical schools in the United States that have adopted formal mindfulness programs as facets of their clinical practice. Clinically, mindfulness is used to treat anxiety, stress, PTSD, addiction, and to even manage pain in cancer patients, among other things, which is to say, somebody knows something regarding the value of mindfulness training. And mindfulness, to paraphrase, is nothing more than a way to train your attention using your ordinary senses and perceptions. That said, I want to emphasize the informal practice of mindfulness that focuses on short-term, repetitive practice to cultivate present moment awareness. By doing so, I want to dispel a few of the objections to this that some of you are already thinking of. First and foremost, the issue of time commitment. And you'll get a sense of this in what follows shortly. And you'll also see that these techniques do in fact rely upon the basic use of your own senses. So let's start by taking a step back and think about this in terms of that model of situational awareness. So earlier we identified some areas of distinct risk here. Risk and failure to correctly perceive and comprehend the environment to such a degree that our near-term projection of the environment may in fact have exited the zip code that we occupy. So where does present moment awareness enter into this process of situational awareness? And I'm going to suggest up front, as opposed to our consideration of situational awareness after the fact. So this is what I'm suggesting. Why not make the effort to front load the process of situational awareness by enhancing our attention and focus to enhance perception, comprehension, and projection? Specifically, I want you to consider that your situational awareness Your ability to function in a dynamic environment really begins as a mental exercise. Now, that said, what sort of exercises might we put into practice to cultivate awareness? What follows is a quick tour of exercises designed to focus your attention. Most of these require no more than 5 minutes at any given time. So here we go. Practical tools to cultivate awareness. The first of these and most prominent that you're going to find in any discussion of mindfulness is mindful breathing. And this is fairly basic. And there is a video in the references that I've supplied Andy and Jack. So this involves just sitting upright, stable, in alert position. Once you get settled in, you're going to focus on the sensation that is most prominent to you that is tied to your breathing, whether it's the coolness of the air moving in and out of your nose or mouth, the movement of your chest or abdomen, or the rise and fall of your shoulders, whatever bodily sensation tied to breathing that is most evident or obvious, the exercise is to focus on that sensation. The second part of this is just simply to pay attention to what arises up here. So notice when mind wandering occurs and your attention is moved off the target of your breathing. When this happens, just simply return your attention back to the breathing related sensation that you decided to focus on. Nothing terribly special. Just simply return the attention back to breathing. In effect, all we are doing is teaching the brain to become a diligent observer of nature, in this case, your nature, and to focus its attention. We are, in fact, creating muscle memory. With repetition, we're teaching the brain to focus on the present moment. And there is nothing more related to the present moment than your own breath. So, a simple tool to direct attention and focus. The close cousin to mindful breathing is tactical breathing, and it's the shorthand version of mindful breathing. This involves taking a deep breath over a short count, holding that over a short count, and then releasing the breath over a short count. And then this is repeated 3 to 4 times. And it is absolutely startling as to how quickly this can instill calm and reorient your focus to where it ought to be. This practice is most frequently associated with military or law enforcement personnel, hence the name tactical. It's also referred to as box breathing. Personal example now. Recall now that many of us are required to periodically undergo a fire physical to maintain our fire qualifications. Because I am of a certain age, I have a certain issue with blood pressure. So when I am entering the physician's office for that fire physical, I in fact have already gone through 3 or 4 rounds of tactical breathing before that blood pressure cuff gets slapped on my arm. The truth of the matter is, I typically lower my blood pressure by 15 points in the space of 2 minutes. These breathing exercises focus attention, minimize distraction. And in minimizing distraction, reduce external stress. Stress being an obvious correlate of blood pressure. So these techniques work. They may not be intuitive, but they work. So up next, using environmental cues. And this involves choosing something in your environment that you will use as a trigger. to remind you to bring your mind back to the present moment, identifying where you're at mentally or where you should be at in any particular moment. So in the field, this may be a particular sound, a sight, or feature. For example, if you're on a fire and you're wearing a radio, it could be the sound of someone keying a mic, the sight or sound of a bird, any cue for which you reach an agreement with yourself to perform that check-in that asks you if you are truly present, your attention focused where it ought to be, and then refocusing it if need be. So for me, if I'm driving the daily NASCAR event that is Highway 127 in central Michigan, when a car overtakes me and passes me, that is in fact the environmental cue that I use to refocus my attention to the task at hand, which is driving. And it's very similar exercise related to environmental cues is what's known as a 3x3 exercise. And so this incorporates features of tactical breathing and the use even of environmental cues. So you would identify 3 environmental cues, and then in recognizing one of those cues, you'd have 1 round of tactical breathing, move to my 2nd environmental cue, another tactical breath, 3rd environmental cue, another tactical breath. So this in effect just combines 2 techniques, but again, wonderfully effective in redirecting your attention to the present moment. So STOP, this acronym, is a tool that has its origin in the Veterans Administration and their treatment of PTSD in veterans. And the intent here was to develop a tool that might interrupt unhelpful thought, inappropriate emotion, and allow an individual to step back and regroup. So the word STOP is used to signal the need to pause what you're doing externally, pause what's going on internally, and I'll call that the deep pause, then take a deep breath or initiate a round of tactical breathing, deliberately observe your environment, take into account, for example, those environmental cues, and having considered your environment, then to proceed. Even for me, someone who absolutely hates the use of acronyms, this makes complete sense. And in my own experience, genuinely serves to focus my attention. And to be honest, I use this as much or more as any of these other tools. This acronym is memorable, and the procedure makes sense. Memorable, meaningful. Mindful listening. So this technique asks the brain to focus on sounds in the environment as opposed to visual cues. And this can be as simple as a 60-second exercise. In my case, when it's above 40 degrees, I head to the front porch at about 5 o'clock in the morning with a cup of coffee. And my goal there is simply to listen to the sounds I encounter in my own yard and across the lake. The key to this exercise is to simplify. Simply listen to the noise in your environment as opposed to mentally cataloging, deliberating, evaluating, whatever. The idea is to train the brain to be an observer of nature. If your mind strays, just bring it back, focusing on sound. The fact of the matter is, this can be a downright pleasant exercise. The extension of this is active listening. And active listening refers to a pattern of listening that keeps you engaged with your partner in conversation. It is the process of listening attentively, deliberately, while someone else speaks, paraphrasing and reflecting back what is said. So where might that fall within the 10 standard firefighting orders? Well, it's on the receiving end of standard order number 8. Give clear instructions and ensure they are understood. But I would like to take this one step further to suggest that there isn't any better gift that you can give your colleagues, friends, or family than your undivided, undistracted attention. I don't think I can add to this. And I don't think that there's anyone here today that can convince me otherwise. So I'm going to suggest that cultivating present moment awareness has tremendous value. And in particular, for those of us concerned about fire line safety, may have value for building and sustaining your situational awareness, as well as having very real collateral benefits. So one more example as to how these tools fit within our existing standards of practice. So a colleague of mine coined the term situational presence to wed these ideas of situational awareness and present moment awareness. And I think it's a good one. With that, let's return once more to Micah Ensley and her definition of situational awareness. So if we're serious about cultivating, building, and sustaining situational awareness, we ought to take into account our own internal environment, front-loading the process to enhance our present moment awareness in order to build and sustain situational awareness. So to begin to close the loop, my objectives for this talk were to demonstrate how our patterns and volume of thought may affect our situational awareness. And then to suggest that situational awareness might well be enhanced by cultivating present moment awareness. That is, by training our brains to pay attention. And if we can train the brain, maybe in fact we have an obligation to do so. And lastly, to give you a brief survey of practical tools that will promote present moment awareness, in the words of a colleague, situational presence. So I want to leave you with one real world example and then a final thought in terms of a goal. So this photo is actually from the 2019 fire at Seeley Lake, Montana, which is actually about an hour away from my mom's house along the Swan River. This was a fire managed by one of our Eastern area incident management teams. My first fire over 20 years ago was just south of here in the Bitterroot Range on the same forest, the Lolo National Forest. We were a Type 2 Indiana interagency crew, and we were assigned to mop up an area that looked very much like this one. Our crew was dispersed, hot spotting, mopping up when another individual in my assigned squad made deliberate eye contact with me, addressed me by name, and said something to the effect, "Clark, we need to move." And I must have looked puzzled because here I was in this burned out, hard black, bomb-proof area, and I thought I was golden. And looking puzzled, he looked at me again and said, "Clark, we need to move." And then he explained the rotor wash of the approaching helicopter could easily knock down some of these trees. So what my crew member did was in effect to stop, take that breath, observe his environment, and then proceed to act. But what he did was to proceed to act on my behalf, not only ensuring my safety that day, but better equipping me for every other incident in my future. So one last concluding thought in terms of a goal. build your situational awareness personally, apply it collectively. It absolutely will make a difference in the lives of those we care about, or a difference in the lives of those we serve. It's been a wonderful privilege to participate in this meeting. I want to thank you all for your attention. So, Jack?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clark. I know you had a couple more slides there with your resources, but we've definitely been pumping those out in the chat box that everyone can take a look at. All documented there with web links and everything. And I just think this is a fantastic presentation, really cool connection, things that maybe we don't think about. You know, we're used to the typical fire effects types of presentations, and this was just fantastic. I thank you very, very much for joining us.
You're most welcome, and I do genuinely regard this as a privilege to be here, Andy. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, we sure do appreciate it. It was fantastic. You can go ahead and end that shared screen. Yes, thank you very much, Clark. We really do appreciate it, and that was a great presentation. We are sitting at past 11:05, so hopefully the people who are popping in to tune into our next speaker are ready to go. You know, we reached out and shot big and got what I think is a fantastic addition to our lineup here in Morgan Varner. He is the Director of Research and Senior Scientist at Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy in Tallahassee, Florida. And I think he is going to give us a fantastic presentation today on prescription fire science, management and science needs for fire-prone Great Lake ecosystems. So I hope Morgan can pop up and turn his video on and share his screen here. And yes, once again, there's a longer version of the introduction to Morgan there in the chat box. And if you have any questions whatsoever, I know there were some cool comments submitted during Clark's presentation. And I think that we ran that right up against time, but certainly Clark can maybe pop into chat and see if he can add anything to that. Morgan, you out there? I see him on as a co-host.
Yes, he's co-hosted. I don't know if he's not unable to mute or unmute.
Yeah. Well, we apologize for this technical delay here. I assure you we'll get Morgan on here as soon as we can.
Andy, do you want to text him?
Yeah. I can do that. Hey, Morgan. Hey, we're waiting on you for popping in. I see you're on and you're co-hosted. Oh, no worries. We're good and ready to go. We'll have a good laugh. All right, see ya. All right, I got a hold of him, and he just popped outside, so we should have him shortly. Yeah, so I hope you know, there was some really good takeaways from Clark's presentation here. You know, for those of us who are a little bit more applied in our focus with prescribed fire, and using that link between situational presence and situational awareness that Clark is describing to help us better and more effectually demonstrate our jobs. Next up, we have another egghead like myself, and as a preeminent egghead in prescribed fire science, he's often pulled in a lot of different directions. So I think he was had stepped out just for a moment there to handle some fires. I do believe the screen has been shared. Morgan, you
Am I there?
I got you.
Okay.
Fantastic. If you wanted to turn on your video, or we ready to roll. I've introduced you, and we're good to go.
Okay, sorry, I'm having a little bit of issue here. One sec.
No worries. Part of the pandemic world and getting these silly webinars all lined up, but
Almost there. And there we go.
cool. It
You
looks
there?
good from my end. So,
Okay,
okay.
good.
Morgan Varner, Tall Timbers Research Station in Land Conservancy in Tallahassee, Florida. I'll let him take it away. And any questions or anything you've got, feel free to throw them into the chat. And we will wrap up today with hearing from Morgan. So thank you very much. Take it away, Morgan.
Well, thanks, Andy, and thanks for your time and attention. I'm excited to talk to you about this topic today. For 12 years, I was a college professor across the country in California, Mississippi, and Virginia. I was a research lead for the Forest Service R&D in Seattle. I've lived all over the place, and I will embarrassingly say the last of my 48 states to visit was Michigan. I did so this summer, and I did it right. So anyway, I wish I was there in person to see you all, and in particular at a different time of year. Anyway, I'm really stoked to talk to you about this topic. I know it's something that gets folks from all the way from the management side to the pure, as Andy said, the egghead researchers excited, because it's the natural marriage of something that we all do, whether it's me doing research on it or you applying it. So this general topic of prescribed fire science. So we can put this in the chat, and I think Andy may have already shared it with you. We published a paper this last year on this topic that has a lot more information that will go well beyond what I talk about today. But it was really getting at a research agenda for prescribed fire, looking at prescribed fire more carefully, something that we all use and that a lot of us do research on, but there are some disconnects and really some, in many ways, kind of some gaps in how, for me, how I do my science, and for you, the decision support that you require. So this paper, you can see the names of people. It's from folks all over the country, and it has involved all these logos and probably many more. And in general, what we came to understand is that prescribed fires nationally burn somewhere between 10 and 14 million acres a year. That value varies a little bit. If you include ag acres, it increases. If there are some within or year to year variation a little bit. And wildfires obviously are really variable. But in general, prescribed fires either exceed about 6 of every 10 years or are pretty dang close at almost every year, the same extent as wildfires. But yet our research community really focuses disproportionately on wildfires. If we look at the funding for fire research, it's about a 3-to-1 ratio from the Joint Fire Science Program. And if we look at where, in a lot of ways, in the publish or perish mode, we need to publish our research to communicate with our peers and to communicate with you in either the International Journal of Wildland Fire, which is our premier journal, or Fire Ecology. In IJWF, it's a 3-to-1 ratio of wildfire-focused articles to prescribed fire. And in Fire Ecology, it really ought to be a 2-to-1 for prescribed fire, but in general, at least over a little more than a decade of looking at articles, there are 50% more articles on wildfire topics than there are prescribed fire. If you think about it from a researcher standpoint, we want to control as much as we can possibly control. And so our ecological research ought to be really constrained and ought to fit prescribed fire really well. So both of those are pretty surprising, given the extent of prescribed fires and your obvious needs in a lot of different ways. And so what we started to do was to look at how they're different. And some of these are pretty obvious. And I hope that a few others stimulate some conversation and some thought on your part. But clearly there's a difference in focus, whether it's fire behavior, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these, how we think about fuels, something that is, fuels are what they are, but they're different. At least our focus in fuels is different from prescribed fire to wildfire. Fire weather and climatology have some pretty strong differences, at least the focal areas. Fire effects being that they're typically, the primary or secondary objective has fire effects involved, whether it's, reduction of fire hazard, changing, fuel loading by time lag class, or causing mortality of species X, or minimizing mortality of species Y. There's some obvious differences in cost and economics. The operational challenges are pretty straightforward. And then there are some nuanced social, political, and legal differences that I think you're all probably struggling with. So if we talk about fire behavior first, I think these images on the right, they say a lot. These are Northern California fires. They clearly are very different from wildfires. In all prescribed fires, ignitions are intentional. They certainly are during wildfire suppression efforts, but you're deciding to ignite, and you're igniting in a certain pattern, whether it's those strip head fires at the top of the screen, or it's that tree-centered spot firing that's occurring at the bottom. For all prescribed fires, the interaction between fire lines is a dominant theme. We ignite fires in succession to interact with the fire line near it, and I think that's a tremendous difference between wildfires and prescribed fires. And basically, the decision support tools that we use to predict rate of spread. So we use the Rothermel, the Behave family, and the broader number of models that use the same Rothermel equations. They can't handle fire line interactions. And it becomes a tremendous issue when you're trying to use a model to support your decisions if the model was never built for it and can't handle it. Backing fire is tremendously important in prescribed fire, and it's often a bit of a, if you're thinking about, if you're a fire behavior researcher and you're going to study flanking, heading, or backing fire would be the folks who lost out on the Rochambeau. Why would you want to try to understand something that is the least intense and has all these other sort of negative connotations? Prescribed fires, for most of the country anyway, are daytime. Wildfires obviously occur 24 hours a day, and so the daytime fluctuations in incoming solar radiation, the effects of clouds interacting with solar radiation, those are huge topics for prescribed fire. And from a wildfire standpoint, they can be relatively minor. Importantly, the wildfire spread models, or the wildfire models, I just slipped up there and called them wildfire spread models, because that's their primary output. It is looking at rate of spread. That's how Rothermel's model was built. It was to predict where the fire is going to be in an hour or in 12 hours. And for prescribed fire, because you're igniting a fire that runs into another one, like that top image or the bottom image, you're really not as concerned about spread rates. It's important, but it's not the primary factor. Intensity is really the primary factor you're worried about, whether it's minimizing scorch or causing mortality. And then in general, this concept of a marginal fire, which is something that the lead author on that paper, Kevin Hires, who works here at Tall Timbers, has really focused on. And that is, we often are igniting prescribed fires at the coolest weather conditions, the wettest, the coolest, and those end up being fires that are really, they miss on, they're not covered very well when you're looking at a worst case scenario, which is what the Rothermel family generally depicts. So I think there's some pretty obvious differences in fire behavior. And so the way that we think about modeling and using these in a predictive standpoint is fundamentally different. These two images are screen captures from the model FireTech that works very similar to the model QuickFire that you may have seen a couple of recent webinars on. But basically, this top left image is showing on that. In the left image, you can see the linear paths here of fire lines, right? And you can see these linear strips that are moving together. They're causing some individual tree torching or some crowning behavior here. And then on the right, looking at the downdrafts and the updrafts. And what this image depicts is you can still see where the linear features were, where you're putting these strips. But what you see is what we all observe in prescribed fires. If you have those that are seasoned enough to stand back and watch fires go and aren't focused on what's coming out of the drip torch, you see a lot of weird patterns along roads. This is in our fundamental, introductory fire training. But you also see that updrafts and downdrafts matter from a potential escape, and they also matter from for spotting and a lot for firefighter safety, where you're positioning people, in this case, in an area that should be the safest area. You can see how diverse these winds are from a downdraft and an updraft standpoint, really complex, and the ability then for spots to make it into this unburned unit on the right-hand side is pretty great. And so these sorts of modeling approaches that don't use the typical Rothermel spread equations really start to get at that. And they can get at all sort of other options, whether it's using helicopters or ATVs or hand ignition. So this is the importance of that fire behavior beyond just that they're different. They're different. From a fuel standpoint, fuels are fuels. But the way we've always modeled fuels has been at a really coarse scale, whether it was the original 11 that then transferred into the original, what we call the original 13 fuel models that then made it into the 42 to 45, depending on how you count them. But those coarse scale models really, for anyone who's ignited and spent a lot of time with prescribed fire, there's a tremendous amount of variation within. And so whether it's trying to predict emissions, whether it is the spatially and temporally patchy nature of moisture, whether it's in the shade, on the edge of the unit, in the middle of the unit, et cetera, those fine scale differences can become really, really critical. And here at emphasizing the spatial and the temporal scale, there's a move, thanks to thinking about fires from a prescribed fire standpoint, to look at fires in 3 dimensions, not just tons per acre, which is either a 1D or a 2D, but to think about how it's vertically arranged. And the 4D, that 4th dimension, is time, and that gets at the changes in moisture over the day. So models that can incorporate those will obviously give you a greater assurance to use those decision support tools as support for your decision, or in a gaming sort of approach, rather than, yes, I included the potential fire behavior in my burn plan, which is, it's not good for you, it's not good for anyone. And I think, this is a kind of a classic. This is a prescribed fire last May here on Tall Timbers. It's pretty classic, shot of prescribed fire. We ignited this at the really wimpy end. It's a growing season fire. That high diversity of species in the foreground has really diverse fuel moisture, has really diverse fuel structure. You can see how there's a shrubby horizon that is above, or the stratum that it's above, grassy, that's burning beneath it. It's generating lots of smoke. The smoke's not doing at all what we thought it was going to do. It's laying down. It was a very difficult day. all of us you could raise your hands right now if you've had days like this where you say, I really thought it was going to do something different. And even though practitioners here have burn 100,000 acres a year, this is the kind of stuff that happens. And us understanding this before we commit resources, before we apply the fire so that we get the desired effects is obviously critical. Weather is also sort of weather, but the way we think about prescribed fire, and many of you, again, if you're doing the raising the hand, you're basically could be a weatherman or a weatherwoman. We are all, if you're applying prescribed fire, the changes that occur during the day with the pattern of relative humidity, with the differences in the mixing height or the transport winds, with what the temperature is going to be, what the sunlight's going to be during the day, we're all end up being experts at it, as much as we want to try to ignore it. Certainly during prescribed fire season, I know the weather every day. I understand what's going to happen at 2 o'clock, what's going to happen at 4, and what the evening is going to be from a relative humidity standpoint. And so all of these sorts of issues, really thinking about it at the fine scale. The ignition sources for wildfires are obviously different than they are for wildfires. This marginal fire, we tend to burn prescribed fire under a marginal standpoint and not on the other end with extreme fires that we certainly do, or that are ignited by wildfires. And in general, there's a subtle difference between wildfires where you're looking at climate because you're interested in the availability of coarse fuels or stress in plants that's going to cause their live fuel moisture to decline, versus for prescribed fires when we're really focused on weather data and weather observations that we're making. We're all reporting the weather and our observations over the radio, and that's a very different general construct than the climate focus of wildfire. And all of these result in prescribed fire practitioners have a deep understanding of weather, not from today's a good day to burn or a bad day, but really you're building you have a model that's running in your head, and you're all end up being experts at it. And I think that's a huge challenge because the propensity for fire managers to move all over the country, from a prescribed fire standpoint anyway, means that you arrive in an area where you don't understand how fickle this east wind event might be, or how common it is for a certain occurrence to be frequent during the prescribed fire season. That sort of local knowledge is a real challenge from a prescribed fire standpoint. And so building models that can help us with that, not do that work for us, but that can help us with that is clearly a missing area. And when we think about climate and think about weather, the way that we've looked at some of the early work we've been doing to look at something as simple as the availability of prescribed burn, acceptable weather, acceptable prescribed burn windows. And so in some of this work, we've looked at a month every year for 30 years and looked at see how individual months, how stable they are from a prescribed fire standpoint, as having wide open windows, to how difficult they are. So this is a grab from this paper where you can see in the dark green, the windows are wide open. And so you see here in Tallahassee where we are, windows looking pretty good. We're getting about 40% of the days in this month where we're getting good conditions. You can see in the Panhandle, this is Eglin Air Force Base, probably the most burned area in the U.S. They've got even better weather during that period. And you can see the difficulty in the Southern Appalachians. You can see the difficulty as we get closer to you in this image with how narrow the window is during that month. So those sorts of analyses are critical for long range planning, but also to be able to challenge. In our case, we were interested in, could we change the windows within a state? In Florida, there's a relatively narrow window of prescribed fire. The prescribed fire window is relatively narrow. Is there a way we could get more burning days if we manipulated some of those mixing height, transport wind type of scenarios, or that we think about burning during other conditions? I'm a fire ecologist. This is what I really work on. is fire effects, and prescribed fire effects. Obviously, I mentioned earlier, it's the primary or in the top two of the objectives for while you're burning. And what we generally get from wildfires is something like this, monitoring trends in burn severity, MTBS projection. This is the Biscuit Fire in southwestern Oregon and northwestern California, where we get this, variation you can see in the colors from an unchanged to a high severity, and you see the size of these patches. Well, this image here is from a single, about a 250 acre prescribed fire unit in South Georgia that Tall Timbers burns every year or every other year. And what you can see in this image is the really fine scale patterns. Here you can see this, the spatial scale of this, but you can see there are itty bitty little patches. From a prescribed fire standpoint, we might want those patches to be areas where we're trying to get tree regeneration, because this site, we're burning it every year or every other year. It's difficult to get establishment of longleaf pine even under even for a species like that. And so we're interested in this really fine scale pattern. This entire image would be sitting in a little tiny pixel like that in the MTBS. This is not even projected on the MTBS. And so thinking about prescribed fire differently from an area where you're igniting something with a torch, making a decision that's going to have long-standing ecological consequences. So this patchiness matters. Reiterating the marginal extreme fires, the scales clearly differ. And in general, because we have the ability to make a decision in prescribed fire, the season, we're determining it because we're saying it's going to occur on this day. So we can go beyond season and really think about day or even time of day. We're also managing within a weather window, and so it could be a drier or a more marginal fire. Clearly, we're modifying or controlling the size, or at least we hope we control the size by having boundaries on the burn unit. And we know where it's occurring. We can determine frequency because we're igniting it at that time, and we'll revisit it, for the next iteration. And we're controlling shape, et cetera. So all those factors that a wildfire happens and occurs, but a prescribed fire, you're making those decisions ahead of time in a very careful way. And so those are clearly very strong differences. My focus of my research has been on tree mortality, and within tree mortality, it's been on reintroducing fire in long unburned stands. This is a longleaf pine stand at Eglin Air Force Base, where the surface fire is already out of the image. This is a false color thermal infrared, and you can see the variation in temperature. That yellow white is hot, and this purple is cold. Here's a 300-year-old longleaf pine. Here's a probably close to 300-year-old longleaf pine. You can see another one back in the far left background, and you can see them scattered about. And what you notice from this is the same thing we notice if it's ponderosa pine in the west, or perhaps red pine in your region. Reintroducing fire, the surface fire is long gone. These trees suffered very little crown scorch. What they are suffering is long duration smoldering. And so to understand what happens at such a small scale, this is really within the drip line of a tree. It requires a very different focus than than sort of the tools we're given with wildfire. We look at severity as a correlate of mortality. We really miss out on what the mechanism was, what caused it. And because we're making the decision to ignite, we need to understand those mechanisms really clearly. And when I was a professor, I was also the chair of the National Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils, and went around to prescribed fire councils like your meetings all over the country to think about how we engage the communities of practice, how we engage prescribed fire practitioners, and look at different aspects. Clearly, the social, political, and the legal environment of prescribed fire versus wildfire are really starkly different. Wildfires are acts of God, and for prescribed fire, we're basically asking society permission to ignite. And so their favorability for prescribed fire is important. And really, what do they see as the issues surrounding prescribed fire? The nuance and the detail in those becomes really, really important. none of us probably wants a wildfire to be burning in our neighborhood. But because it's an act of God, we get a get out of jail free card. Whereas if we're igniting a prescribed fire, having strong social support, having an understanding of what our long-term objectives are, all that sort of stuff that gets at the interaction with society is critically important. Prescribed fire, in contrast to wildfire, is an overwhelmingly private permission. There are 50 states, and all 50 states have different rules for prescribed fire. And their rules are often focused on private landowners and a private landowner's ability to request a permit, or whatever every individual state has. And I think that's a really interesting, dialogue, an interesting conversation that occurs 50 different states over 365 days of the year. And it's very different from having a large fire management plan or, making a decision where you're getting public input and implementing it. And so that private part becomes a really interesting dialogue. There are private benefits that are also won by using prescribed fire and trying to have a dialogue about the ecosystem services provided by, burning on an adjacent property to your own health, your own, regional biodiversity, the different birds that come to your feeders, all the way to your own safety are really important conversations. There are clearly important regional and cultural differences. I already mentioned that the state laws dominate, and that becomes really complicated. There's obviously a major role in communication. We communicate for wildfires in a certain way, but prescribed fires, because we're asking permission, that communication is really different. And from a social science standpoint, I mentioned this communities of practice. That's a pretty interesting field to investigate, and largely, not everywhere, but largely, even though a prescribed fire council may have 300 people attend, it's been left behind by university researchers, by federal researchers, or NGOs like my own group, that they don't think of these groups as, a group of 300 people that all came together to learn more about how to improve their craft. If it were, how to change some of the cogs within a sawmill, a university cooperative would stand up really quickly and say, we need to be able to help sawmills throughout state X build something better. But prescribed fire practitioners are often left behind in this. Unfortunately, it's the major, to me, the primary value of the prescribed fire councils. But it's something that we really, crafting something like calling it prescribed fire science gives credence to something like building communities of practice and understanding what their needs are. The operations of prescribed fire, I don't really need to say this very much. If any of you have seen a situation like that bottom picture, large fire camps versus this poor fella at the top who's got a drip torch and he's dragging fire through an oak woodland. Those are about an hour apart in Northern California, but clearly the economics are strong differences. The operational impediments are present and important in prescribed fire. The need for good decision support tools. Most prescribed fire practitioners either laugh or they say something like our expected, our modeled rate of spread today is going to be 6.2 chains per hour, or the flame lengths are going to be 3.1 feet. Knowing full well that 3.1 feet or 6.2 chains per hour is ridiculous. And of course, we always observe in the unit, you're clicking in on the radio to say, I have some individual tree torching, 15 minutes or an hour after someone said we'd be expecting 3.1 foot flame lengths. So the need for better decision support tools is pretty clear. The analogy we've made in some of the modeling work that Tall Timbers has been engaged in is if you're going to take a C-130 or any commercial airline up in the sky, that pilot has to go through a flight simulator. They have to go through a tremendous amount of simulated, modeled potential outcomes. And for prescribed fire, we've got models that all of us go, this is not really working that well. And so to imagine what we would have if we had the same sort of investment from a flight simulator approach, or think about other fields where they go through pretty intensive simulation training. And then lastly, in this, wildfires are responses, and they certainly have planning that is, what's going to happen in this calendar year in this region. But prescribed fires are planning both from a multi-year to what's going to happen today. And I think that immediacy, that sense of urgency is something that really, it begs for better decision support. It begs for a more formal engagement. And from a research standpoint, putting a moniker on this and calling it prescribed fire science gives us the ability to craft research questions that are needed by practitioners and are specific for prescribed fire. And so in some ways, I ask you to kind of relax your brain from thinking, well, what about wildfire? If you kind of put that away for a second and we think about prescribed fire, there's a ton of research that we need to do on interaction of fire lines. All of us have observed it. You'll see, this backing fire from the strip that's 15 feet away or 30 feet away or 150 feet away is already starting to lean into this head fire that's moving toward it. We've all seen this happen. We've seen a tattered line and erratic fire behavior that occurs, or the fire behavior is really subdued and we don't meet our objectives. And so thinking about fire behavior from an interaction of fire lines area really opens up a tremendous amount of potential research into what causes fires to tick the way they tick. That issue of marginal fire behavior is obviously important. We tend to focus fire research on the extreme fires and not on the ones that really probably are covering more acres in America, and those are those marginal fires. Prescribed fire, because it's generating smoke, has the ability for us to be able to better understand smoke and better understand how we manage it. From an emissions standpoint, it obviously offers a lot of promise. We can take drones that capture smoke samples throughout a plume. We can put a smoke sampler on a black line. We can put a smoke sampler anywhere in a prescribed fire. And that sort of research and that sort of work is very difficult from a wildfire standpoint. It allows fire ecologists like me to think about the relevant fire effects. My focus is on tree mortality. I want to understand which trees die and which trees survive. And the scale that I'm interested in is individual trees. That's often what our question is, not whether the stand is going to have 50% mortality or 70% mortality, but understanding I have high value trees that have an endangered species that uses them for nesting. I need to have a really good picture of whether that tree will live or die. And so taking that scale from the kind of coarse scale satellite approach to looking at individual trees and looking at individual clusters of trees is really powerful from a research standpoint. Linking fuels and fire behavior, a fundamental question that has emerged over the last decade is, at what scale do fuels matter? We always have measured fuels from a unit level. It's this site has 10 tons per acre, 1 ton of 1 hour fuels, 2.2 tons, that sort of thing. But we know that the spatial pattern of fuels matters, and trying to figure out at what scale that matters is really, really important, because if we can do that, we can better predict fire behavior, we can better predict fire effects, we can better predict emissions and smoke. And prescribed fire offers us that ability. And then lastly, and this list could be 74 questions, but how do we overcome the impediments to prescribed fire? How do we look at operational impediments? How do we look at impediments with society? And those sorts of questions are obviously critical for how fire is applied and where it can be applied successfully across the country. If I allow you to now raise your objections again, When we first talked about this, I gave this as a presentation about 4 years ago at a conference, an earlier version, and people were like, wait a minute, you're ignoring wildfires. Wildfires are really important. And our point has always been that prescribed fire science deserves to be focused on, and that the gains that we get in understanding prescribed fire will overlap with our understanding of wildfire. If we understand marginal fires better, we're going to understand how wildfires behave better. If we understand how fire lines interact, because obviously we're igniting in suppression operations, and those ignited suppression fires interact with the spreading wildfire. And so certainly those things will offer overlap. And for a lot of areas, we're using managed wildfires, and don't hate me for saying that, but we're managing wildfires for resource benefit. And those, in a lot of ways, start to behave like prescribed fires. And so getting more prescribed fire science will benefit, the larger field of wildfire science. And then lastly, there's a lot of talk, and prescribed fire councils are really where this sort of work takes place. And that work is co-production, where managers and scientists have a dialogue, and you say, this issue is really eating my lunch. And a scientist has the ability to follow up and say, well, I've heard you say that, but what do you really mean? Like, how's it eating your lunch? Give me an example. Can I visit your site and see what you're talking about? And it allows for then the scientist to be able to say, all right, we're going to design a project that is, it's going to meet my scientific rigor, and I'll get my deliverable out of it, but you'll also get, actionable science. That is, we're going to generate science that helps you with this problem that's eating your lunch. And I think that prescribed fire science is really made for this co-production. And with that, I'll close. My email address is there. Other folks who are really key in this from the Northern Station and throughout the country, we're all happy to talk about this issue and to engage with you on it. And I hope this was stimulating for you. With that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Varner. Really, really appreciate that. I will admit to bringing this up to the planning committee and reading the paper that y'all had published in Fire Ecology, and that link was shared with everyone. So be sure to check that out, read through that, and get a more in-depth understanding of the things that Dr. Varner was trying to share with us. We do have a little bit of time for questions if you want to stick around, Morgan. I think the one thing that really came out is how do we go about badgering out some change in the research bias? Is naming this as prescribed fire science enough? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that was, obviously it's raising the problem is one thing and trying to get some change. What we've done, we've presented this to Washington Office R&D for Forest Service. Forest Service has primarily been they've historically been the primary funder of fire research. That's where fire research nationally is generally focused. USGS, we've done the same thing because they're an emerging, sort of a sleeping giant with applied fire research. And then we've engaged the Joint Fire Science Program. They were surprised when we mentioned when we did the analysis and came up with a roughly 3-to-1. The program manager was like, "Are you sure that's right?" And I said, "Here are the numbers. I'm going to show you. I categorize this one as a wildfire, this one as a prescribed fire." And I think the editors, I'm on the editorial board of both those journals, and Fire Ecology picked up this paper, and the editor has, they've said, shame on us. We need to reach out more. Prescribed fires research sometimes ends up being, everything wasn't perfect. And I think any of us who've done research on prescribed fires, Andy, you did a lot of it in your dissertation. How many times did you think to yourself, I'm not sure this is actually going to be pulled off. I'm not sure we're going to be able to burn this unit today. And imagining from a scientist standpoint, what that's going to do to the potential acceptability of your paper is really damning. And so Fire Ecology, to their credit, has really started to ramp up case studies, because that's often what we end up with if we only got 3 of the 4 burns or 16 of the 21 planned burns. The journal Fire is also doing case studies now too, that's trying to embrace this general model. But I think really pushing on, the funders, because that's ultimately where this is going to come from, I think is is where we're still trying to make some headway. I was on a call yesterday talking about prescribed fire to the National Science Foundation and others. And I think that's the way we, from our side, that's what we do. And then from a manager standpoint, I think trying to push it in your own way, because each of you in some ways is engaged in research or engaging with researchers on problems. And I think trying to see that those are important questions and not being afraid to say, that's not a question that would, that's not a question that's going to answer my problem. There's always a sort of like, oh, that's really interesting reply that you give to researchers. I remember when I was pitching my dissertation topic, I had a road trip where I was meeting with managers to pitch my topic. And about the third day I'd heard, I find that really interesting, Morgan, when they clearly didn't think it was going to change what they were doing. And it made me follow up and say, well, what's interesting to you? Like, what do you need? And I think being okay with talking to researchers in that way, saying, that's not that interesting to me, but here's what's really eating my lunch. And I think that's a, sort of a grassroots way to change that.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking on some of the funding challenges, because I will say, just from my own perspective as a researcher, how many times I've had a proposal kicked back of, this is great, this is awesome, but there's some risk in pulling off prescribed fires. Are you going to get them done? Are you going to get them in? Will they be what you want them to be? And I think that that's something. One last quick question before we try to wrap up. I think there was several comments being made while you were talking that I would say kind of relate to this question. How do we get the public to better see this difference? This contrast between wildfires and then prescribed fires, and allowing us to, do more prescribed fire science. One manager here in Michigan threw out the term prescribed burning because they felt like it was, more of a term that kind of flipped it to more of like away from the dangers of fire and the focus on fire to a very different thing. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on, how do we get the public to come along with us on this expansion of a new field and naming it and pursuing research in it?
I'm going to have to use my favorite Zoom trick. Looks like I'm locked.
Oh.
No, it's just a trick. It's just a trick. That's what you do when you don't want to answer a question now. You just do that.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
It's a really, joking aside, it's obviously rubber meeting the road sort of stuff. Tall Timbers, we have engaged in public education campaigns for a long time. The sort of good fires that people remember, that campaign was born out of a Tall Timbers initiative. We have one right now that is whyprescribedfire.org. That is starting to, what we've done is, it's really an interesting, if you've never worked on marketing or ad campaigns, it's something that's totally blown my mind over the last year and a half. And that is, we took the state of Florida, we're the #1 state for prescribed fire in the US, and we overlaid where permits take place across the state. We overlaid where satellite fire detections are across the state. And then we broke them up into zip codes. And then we focused our marketing on those zip codes where we have fire now for 1 year. And then for the next year, the current year we're in right now, we focused on where we want to put fire. And so we changed our messaging around those. And the marketing teams, the advertising groups would bring together focus groups, sort of like you see on TV, and they would say, here are some terms, and they throw out prescribed burning. They throw out prescribed fire. They throw out controlled burning. They throw out control, all the different ways to talk about it. And what they found, at least in Florida, from the pretty intensive market research, is a few things really resonate. They want to know that it's based on science. And so a picture of me in the field where I'm, grasping a grass and going, and it's something like Morgan Varner is a scientist working on, understanding fuel moisture. What that does is it makes society, it makes all the focus groups, it made them go, there's science behind it. They're not just out there flicking a match. They're actually going through, they're talking about weather, they're talking about fuels, they're talking about, they're prepared if it escapes. So they really liked that. They really liked the images of firefighters. And You know, as much as you don't think it, when they see you wearing yellow and they see you with a radio and you're in your engine and you're at a unit, it inspires so much confidence that anything that you do that reaches out to them in that mode, like when I go to the gas station on the way home from the unit, having a conversation at that point, even though you're exhausted and you just want to have another Gatorade, having discussions then they found was really powerful. And so some of our ads have folks with drip torches talking about what they're doing, and it talks about firefighters. So us glowing on to, you know, general people love firefighters. So there are different aspects of that we've gone through, not hiding behind health concerns. A lot of really interesting things. I think that this fall, if in a post-COVID world, the International Fire Congress happens at Destin, that our communication lead is going to talk about some of this market research because it's fascinating. It differs by where you are. And so in Michigan, it may differ completely, but I think the general methods and how we've gone about trying to figure it out are applicable everywhere.
Awesome. Well, with that, I do think we've run short on time, and I think that was just a fascinating paper when I read it, and it was, I think it's a fascinating idea, and I think that, you know, ultimately it's what we're all about, and that's the mission of the Michigan's Prescribed Fire Council, and as you mentioned multiple times in your talk, the mission of many prescribed fire councils across the country. So I definitely want to thank everyone for tuning in and point out for sure to check out the evaluation that Craig Myers just shared in our chat. Take one more opportunity to thank Morgan Varner for joining us. Thank you very much. And I will post his email in the chat if anyone wants to contact him for some of those questions that we didn't quite get answered. And with that, I'll turn it over to Glenn for one final parting shot and be done for the day.
All right, sounds good. I'll just share my screen real quick here. Just wanted to put in a plug for tomorrow. So tomorrow it's all about fire history. We have 4 good presentations coming up tomorrow, and then a panel discussion with those presenters. And I'll be your tour guide for the day tomorrow. So come on back, 9 o'clock, same link. We'll see you guys tomorrow morning. Appreciate everybody joining us today, and appreciate all our presenters and Andy for moderating. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.